Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal beneath the golden hue of the dying sun, the courtyard of the ancient chapel glowed in melancholy splendor, casting long, soft shadows over rows of white chairs and trembling petals scattered delicately along the aisle. The bell tolled, deep and rhythmic, echoing through the air like a somber heartbeat, marking the approach of a life-altering moment. Every guest turned, anticipation thick in the air, as the massive wooden doors creaked open and Willow stepped through, veiled in white, radiant in form yet fragile in spirit. Her movements were graceful, each step deliberate, yet behind the elegance was a soul unraveling, a mind teetering on the brink of collapse. This was not the walk of a bride entering the happiest day of her life. It was the slow, excruciating surrender of a woman backed into a corner, trapped in a ceremony that bore none of the joy it promised. On the surface, she embodied poise and purity. Her dress shimmered subtly in the late afternoon light, her hands clasping a bouquet with just enough strength to hide their trembling. But within her, an invisible storm raged, anguish, fear, and helplessness churning in her chest with every step toward the altar. This wedding, which should have marked the beginning of a beautiful chapter, had become instead a meticulously staged performance, with Drew as the architect and director, and Willow, broken, coerced, its unwilling star. The nightmare had begun when Drew uncovered a horrifying truth. Willow, in a moment of misguided desperation, had secretly monitored Daisy Gilmore, ultimately pressuring Sasha into fleeing Port Charles with her infant child. Rather than confront her, Drew chose silence. He stored the discovery deep within himself like a weapon, carefully gathering evidence to strengthen his hold. Security footage from the Quartermain estate, unauthorized access logs from the hospital's records, even audio snippets from a compromised baby monitor, he compiled them all, waiting for the precise moment when the balance of power would shift entirely in his favor. That moment came, ironically, just as Willow herself was considering abandoning the wedding. Curtis, unaware of the damage his words would inflict, had confided in Willow about Drew's illicit affair with Nina, a betrayal that shattered the illusion Willow had clung to. She had believed Drew to be her sanctuary, a steady force amid the turbulence of her past. Learning of his deceit struck like a bolt to her chest. Her instincts screamed for escape, for truth, for justice. She nearly fled. Nearly. But Drew was prepared. Behind the scenes, he had foreseen her response. In a chillingly quiet moment before the ceremony, as the final guests arrived and the chapel brimmed with floral perfume and polite laughter, he drew her aside. There were no pleas, no apologies. Instead, he presented the cold, undeniable truth: photographs, timestamps, access credentials, all meticulously organized. Proof that she had driven Daisy and Sasha out of town. Proof that, if revealed, would not only destroy her reputation but also strip her of any legal or moral claim to her children. Michael, the father of her kids, a man of fierce integrity, would never forgive such a betrayal. Her social standing, her motherhood, her very identity, were all poised to collapse with a single whispered word from Drew. Her breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her veins like ice water. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape route. She imagined a life where her children viewed her with suspicion, where her name was smeared across headlines, where her past mistakes devoured her future. And so, with her back to the wall and her soul crushed beneath the weight of this invisible noose, she made the only choice left to her: surrender. Willow entered the chapel not as a bride in love, but as a prisoner cloaked in satin and lace, walking toward her captor under the illusion of sacred union. The music that floated gently above the pews felt surreal, disconnected from the anguish that pressed against her ribcage like a vice. Her heartbeat was thunderous in her ears, not from excitement, but dread. She could hear the flutter of tulle around her legs, the whispers of guests admiring her beauty, none of them aware that what they were witnessing was not love, but blackmail refined into ritual. As she reached the altar, her gaze met Drew's. There was no warmth in his eyes, no flicker of regret, only calculated calm, a silent reminder of the trap she was now ensnared in. His smile was subtle and rehearsed, a mask of affection hiding the triumph of domination. Willow's own face remained expressionless, frozen in a mask of passive compliance. When the officiant asked if she would take this man as her husband, the world seemed to blur. Time slowed. Her lungs filled with air as if to scream, but instead, her lips parted gently. A single word slipped out, quiet, trembling, final. Yes. It wasn't consent. It was capitulation. A contract signed in invisible ink, etched with shame and silent despair. The guests erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Music swelled. But for Willow, the moment was suffocating. She was now bound to a man she neither trusted nor loved, tethered not by devotion but by a delicate chain of secrets threatening to crush her at any moment. This was not a union of hearts. It was a pact forged from coercion, deceit, and emotional captivity. The reception that followed was as hollow as the vows. Toasts were raised, laughter rang out, and every well-wisher approached with congratulations, oblivious to the ghost behind the bride's eyes. Willow performed her role flawlessly. She smiled, posed, thanked everyone with a voice that trembled just slightly. Only Drew, ever watchful, noticed the cracks in her composure. And he, ever controlling, placed a steady hand on her back, as if to remind her that she was his now, utterly, completely. And so, beneath chandeliers and chandeliers of crystal, among bouquets and blessings, a tragedy unfolded in plain sight. Willow had not walked into a fairy tale. She had been cornered into a cage gilded with roses, her freedom traded for silence, her love story rewritten as a cautionary tale of what happens when one mistake becomes a weapon in the hands of a ruthless man. But deep within her chest, buried beneath the layers of fear and surrender, something still stirred. A tiny ember of resistance, a whisper of the woman she used to be. She didn't know when or how, but someday, she would find a way to breathe again. To escape. To reclaim her voice. Until that day arrived, she would endure, one agonizing moment at a time, beneath the veil of the perfect bride. After the final words of the ceremony faded into echoes beneath the chapel's vaulted ceilings and the newlyweds exchanged rings, thunderous applause erupted from the pews, friends and family rose to their feet, smiling, clapping, some even wiping tears from their eyes. To them, it was a beautiful moment, two people united in love, celebrating a milestone in their journey together. But for Willow, the noise was deafening, an avalanche of hollow joy that drowned out the silent, persistent scream in her soul. Her heart bled beneath the lace of her gown, aching under the crushing weight of what she had just agreed to. This marriage was not a symbol of love, it was the result of fear, coercion, and calculated manipulation. It was a pact signed in despair, sealed not with affection but with the terror of losing everything she held dear. As the cheers continued and the guests prepared to move toward the reception, Drew turned to her with a smile on his lips, not a smile of tenderness or elation, but of triumph. It was the look of a man who had won a battle, not through affection, but through cunning strategy and relentless pressure. His eyes were cold beneath the warmth of his grin, devoid of the love he so convincingly performed in public. In that moment, he was not a husband celebrating his union, but a victor basking in the spoils of a war fought with secrets and silent threats. The reception hall glittered with luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over carefully arranged tables dressed in ivory linens, golden centerpieces, and extravagant floral displays. Classical music floated through the air, mingling with the chime of champagne glasses and the laughter of well-dressed guests. It was a scene plucked from a fairy tale. Except for the bride sitting at the head table, frozen in place beside her new husband. Willow was a vision of grace, but beneath the flawless exterior, she was a living statue. Her movements were mechanical, rehearsed, every expression mimicked from the expectations of those around her. She smiled at the right moments, nodded when spoken to, and thanked the guests with a voice so soft it barely masked the emptiness in her tone. Her skin was pale, her hands cold, and her eyes. Her eyes were lifeless pools reflecting nothing but silent resignation. The warmth of love had long since drained from her, leaving only the chill of survival. Drew, meanwhile, relished the spotlight. He mingled effortlessly, toasted their new beginning with eloquence, and kept a firm hand on Willow's shoulder, a subtle yet constant reminder of her place. To the outside world, he was charming, attentive, even doting. But Willow knew better. This wasn't affection, it was ownership. Every interaction, every word, every gesture was a calculated move to maintain the illusion and keep her chained to the role he had crafted for her. As the night progressed, she began to notice the extent of his control. He dictated how she should speak during her brief thank you speech, what to say, what not to say, how long to hold eye contact with the audience. When she faltered, his grip on her arm tightened ever so slightly, just enough to remind her he was watching. Even the way she held her wine glass was scrutinized, everything curated, everything measured. Her life had become a performance, and Drew the director who would tolerate no improvisation. It soon became clear that this control extended beyond the evening. In hushed, private conversations between dances and toasts, Drew began laying down the unspoken rules of their new life together. Rules about how they would appear in public. About how often she could visit her children. About what she could say to Michael and what she couldn't. About how her mistakes, the ones he still kept hidden, would never be brought to light, so long as she played her part and obeyed. With each veiled threat disguised as a loving suggestion, Willow felt her autonomy eroding further. Her identity, once a mosaic of resilience, maternal strength, and vulnerability, began to crack under the weight of Drew's control. She was no longer just losing her freedom, she was losing herself. Her beliefs, her choices, her voice were slowly being overwritten by the expectations of a life she never truly chose. She had become a curated accessory to Drew's narrative, a symbol of his success, a puppet in a well-tailored gown smiling on command. And yet, despite the suffocating weight of her new reality, something still stirred within her. Somewhere deep in the hollow shell of her heart, a fragile ember still glowed. It was the last remnant of the woman who had once dared to fight for love, for truth, for family. That part of Willow whispered to her in the quietest moments, in the silence between claps, in the stillness behind every shuttered smile, "You are not broken. Not yet." She knew that if she surrendered completely, she would never get back what had been taken from her. But to resist, to plan an escape, meant risking everything. It meant enduring Drew's scrutiny, pretending to yield while carefully gathering strength. And Drew, always meticulous, always watching, seemed to anticipate every subtle twitch of rebellion before it could take root. His strategies were not loud or violent, they were psychological, built on quiet dominance and carefully applied pressure, designed to make her question her every instinct. Still, Willow began to observe. To listen. To think. Each passing hour taught her more about the prison she had entered. Each small humiliation etched deeper lines of defiance into her spirit. Though outwardly submissive, she began crafting her inner map toward liberation, patiently, secretly. The first step would not be loud or obvious. It would be a thought, then a plan, then a whisper passed in the right ear. She knew she would only have one chance to free herself. But until then, she would continue to play her part. She would wear the mask. She would dance, toast, and smile. And in doing so, she would keep Drew exactly where she needed him, believing she was broken, believing she was his. Because in the shadows of his certainty, she would find the cracks. And when the time was right, she would break free, not as a victim, but as the woman he had underestimated all along. The wedding, which so many around her had heralded as the beginning of a new chapter, was not the culmination of a grand romance. It was the first act in a slow-burning tragedy, a psychological descent cloaked in lace, champagne, and the illusion of love. For Willow, it was not a union, but a sentence. She had not been swept into matrimony by passion or trust but had been pushed, cornered, blackmailed into stepping over the threshold of a life that was no longer hers. The moment she had said yes, she had not stepped into a marriage. She had stepped into a gilded prison, one lined with roses and diamonds, but colder than steel. The world looked on with admiration. Friends and family clinked glasses, posed for pictures, exchanged anecdotes about love and longevity, oblivious to the truth playing out behind the bride's hollow gaze. No one saw the silent implosion happening within her. No one saw how every laugh that escaped her lips had been carefully rehearsed, how every glance toward Drew was laced with calculation rather than affection. What they saw was a fairy tale, what they celebrated was a dream fulfilled. But Willow knew better. She was awake in a nightmare dressed as a fantasy, and every second that passed only deepened her entrapment. Drew had orchestrated it all with masterful precision. Like a puppeteer, he had dangled her secrets in front of her, threatening to expose them if she dared to defy him. He had weaponized her guilt, using her past mistakes as shackles to keep her obedient. There had been no shouting, no overt violence, just pressure, suggestions, reminders. It was psychological warfare waged with a smile. At night, when the laughter had faded and the last of the guests had gone home, Willow lay beside her new husband in silence. The darkness, meant to be a sanctuary, became a crucible. She would stare at the ceiling for hours, too paralyzed by grief and fear to sleep. Every creak of the floor, every sigh from Drew beside her, reminded her that she no longer belonged to herself. She had become a possession, a trophy wife whose presence served his image. She was not a partner, not a woman cherished. She was a captive who smiled on command and performed affection like a role in a play she could not leave. Each night, her mind drifted to the things she had lost. Trust, once sacred, was shattered. Not just trust in Drew, but trust in herself. In her own judgment, her own sense of morality. She had betrayed her values, sacrificed her honesty, and turned to secrecy, and now she was paying the price. Her children's faces haunted her, not because they had been taken from her physically, but because she feared they would one day look at her differently if the truth ever came to light. She feared what they would think of a mother who lied, who manipulated, who surrendered. Most of all, she feared they would see her the way she saw herself, a woman who had failed to protect what mattered most. Even in her waking hours, the cage remained. Drew's control was subtle but absolute. He monitored her words, corrected her tone, reminded her gently, always gently, how their actions reflected on each other. When she tried to make independent decisions, he found a way to intervene. He would phrase his corrections as advice, couch his dominance in the language of love and concern. "You're just tired," he would say when she stumbled through a speech he had prepared for her. "Let me help you with that," he'd insist, even when she protested. Every day, he chipped away at her autonomy until she began to forget what it was like to act on instinct, to speak without fear, to choose without constraint. Worse still was the loneliness. Surrounded by people, Willow had never felt more isolated. The very walls of her home, once symbols of comfort, had become silent witnesses to her surrender. She longed to confide in someone, to scream, to demand an end to the charade, but who would believe her? Who would stand by her side against Drew, who had so masterfully built a facade of decency? Who would understand that her suffering was invisible, that her chains were woven from shame and silence? Yet, beneath all this despair, something fragile yet indestructible remained. A small, trembling voice that had not yet been silenced. A spark. It lived in the moments when she dared to remember who she had been before, the woman who had stood by her convictions, who had fought for those she loved, who had once dared to dream of a life filled with light. That woman was buried now, yes, but she was not gone. She whispered to Willow in the quiet moments, reminding her that endurance was not the same as acceptance. That survival was not submission. Willow began, slowly, to watch. She watched Drew, not with the eyes of a wife, but of a strategist. She listened to his patterns, observed the limits of his control, took note of the people he trusted. Every detail became a puzzle piece. She knew that if she ever hoped to reclaim her freedom, she could not act rashly. She would need to be precise, patient, prepared. She would need to find allies in the shadows, to gather strength when no one was looking. And she would need to be willing to lose everything she had left in order to gain back the one thing Drew had stolen from her, her soul. Until that day came, she endured. She dressed as the perfect wife, smiled as the perfect hostess, played the part Drew demanded. But inside, she sharpened herself into a weapon. She nurtured her anger, fed her resistance, protected the flickering flame of rebellion that no amount of control could extinguish. Because one day, when the timing was right, she would act. And when she did, she would not simply escape, she would rise. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as a puppet, but as a woman reborn from the ashes of manipulation and fear. For now, she lived as the bride imprisoned by her own wedding day. A day that the world celebrated, that Drew claimed as victory, and that Willow would one day mark as the turning point. The beginning of her plan. The moment the cage was sealed, but the fire within began to burn hotter than ever. And so, the days passed like pages in a book Willow had never intended to write, each one inked with silence, each chapter another layer in a story of quiet captivity. She moved through life like a ghost inside her own skin, haunted by the image of the woman she used to be. The gown had long since been hung in the closet, the flowers had withered, the congratulations faded into memory. Yet the weight of that wedding day, the chains it forged, the identity it stripped from her, remained.